Today, what I hope to communicate is that gender-affirming care is life-saving and essential evidence-based healthcare. So we'll talk about what gender diversity and dysphoria are, what gender-affirming care for youth actually involves, because there's so much misinformation out there, and I'd really love for y'all to move forward as voters and activists with the knowledge that is true and correct and evidence-based. And then we'll talk about some resources for how you can be affirming to any gender diverse people in your life so that you can be kind neighbors and loved ones and can help safeguard this community that is experiencing a lot of harm. So I believe that trans rights are human rights, and I'm hopeful that all of you do as well. And I have been thinking about this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. a lot lately. Of all forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. And I think about this so much because I not only live but was trained as a clinician in the birthplace of the civil rights movement. And that's always felt meaningful to me. I'm originally from California, and getting to do the work that I do in the American South feels really meaningful. And so when I talk to other health profession students, I always encourage them to think about this and really decide what kind of healthcare provider they want to be. And right now, this is really resonating so much because the attack on evidence-based healthcare for gender diverse youth is shocking and certainly inhumane. And I hope that you can kind of feel and sense that by the end of this event today. So getting started with gender diversity, like what does that even mean? It means when someone's gender identity, who they know themselves to be, does not align with the sex they were assigned at birth. And it's important to know that this is not a pathology, it's just a variation of normal. And in pediatrics, we like the gender unicorn because it's very fun and whimsical. And it shows that gender identity is something that's distinct from our gender expression and who we're attracted to both physically and emotionally. And you can see it's all a spectrum here. So gender identity, again, it's who you know yourself to be. Gender expression is how you show yourself to the world, and that may or may not align with someone's gender identity in the way you expect it to, and that's okay. And so there's no need to question that. You can just sort of accept it and welcome it and just realize that it is a distinct part of our identity. The sex we were assigned at birth typically has to do with chromosomes, with anatomy, and then our physical and emotional attraction also totally separate from how we identify personally. And so this is really helpful when talking to families and anyone that's kind of learning about what gender diversity is. And there are many ways to be gender diverse, and there is a huge dictionary of all the terms related to diversity out there. These are some of the highlights or most often used terms available from Fenway Health. They're one of my favorite resources. It's important to know that transgender is kind of an umbrella term. It can refer to anyone that has a gender diverse identity. They may not be sort of transgender on the binary. They may be non-binary, maybe agender, gender fluid. Same with queer. That is a term that is pretty umbrella term. And when we talk about someone that's cisgender, that is someone whose gender identity does align with the sex they were assigned at birth. And pronouns are just an important way that we kind of show respect for someone's gender identity. And as we'll learn, it could be he, her, or she, her, he, him, they, them, or any combination really. Of all the above. And PFLAG really has the largest glossary, so you can check that out if you're wanting to see all the new terminology. It's always expanding, so it's something we always need to stay abreast of. And this is one of my newer slides that faculty had encouraged me to include when I was speaking to Emory Med students to talk about, to sort of align terminology. And you may recognize some of these people because they're very awesome, right? And they've been in the media lately. When we're talking about a trans man, that is someone who identifies as a man and is a man of trans experience. Typically, they are assigned female at birth. For trans women, it's the opposite. Someone who identifies as a woman of trans experience, and non-binary can really be kind of open or gender fluid, non-conforming. You may recognize the gentleman, Chase Strangio, who was the first openly trans person to argue before the Supreme Court on behalf of the ACLU in U.S. versus Skermeti. Really incredible and exciting. And then a representative, Sarah McBride, the first openly trans person to serve in Congress as Delaware's only representative. And she's doing amazing things for healthcare access, for paid family leave, all kinds of great stuff. And I love Jonathan Van Ness. He's got like a really cool podcast and fun shows, and a wonderful author and activist for the HIV positive community. So when thinking about gender diversity and transgender identities, it's kind of interesting to think about, like, where does our gender identity even come from initially? And gender identity development is really cool because it's multidimensional and it evolves over time. And so it's really influenced by a number of different factors: biological, psychosocial, cognitive, and it starts at a really young age. Studies show that infants can distinguish gender. Young toddlers start to recognize gender stereotypes. And gender membership really starts to emerge at like 2, 3 years old. So young kids can tell you who they are, which is very cool. And we all know that, right? Because young kids, when they start talking, they're pretty clear about what they want to communicate. And so transgender identity development models, there's many different out there, but one model involves 5 stages for youth that identify as gender diverse, where they have kind of a pre-coming out, a coming out, exploration, intimacy, identity integration. It is important to note that everyone's journey is totally different, and so it doesn't have to follow one trajectory. There's no one right way to be gender diverse or to seek gender affirmation. But it's interesting to think of diverse gender identity development compared to gender identity development in cisgender young people, and it's all very similar, is kind of the point. So young gender diverse kids experience gender identity development very similar to their cisgender peers. In terms of persistence, desistance, that's when a young person identifies as gender diverse. Will they continue to identify as gender diverse into adulthood? Sometimes, right? The older they are and the more severe their gender dysphoria is, the more likely it is to be persistent. Typically, when a postpubertal young person identifies as gender diverse, that's absolutely who they are. It's not going to change. But again, everyone's gender journey is different, and it's important just to be aware, given all of the misinformation in the news, there is no such thing as rapid onset gender dysphoria. That does not exist. And detransition is a really sort of complicated thing. It's rare and it's nuanced, and the fact that some folks detransition is not enough to say that the entire population of gender diverse people do not deserve access to life-saving and essential evidence-based healthcare. And the next slide just shows like a very cool study that was presented at the Pediatric Endocrine Society conference in Maryland this year. This is an older study from 2016, but one of the super experts from UCSF, Dr. Rosenthal, presented this, and it just kind of goes back to that biological multifactorial basis to gender diversity. And what this study showed is that gender diverse natal females, so people assigned female at birth that identified as gender diverse before they had any exposure to testosterone, their brains lit up just like gender males on mental rotation tasks that show sex differentiation. So that was just like really cool, and I think it's just interesting to think about that as and kind of refutes the rapid onset gender dysphoria and whatnot, that there is a biological basis in some part to gender diversity. All right, so moving into gender dysphoria. Again, not a pathology, but we know that in America, we often need a diagnosis to access different forms of healthcare. And so gender dysphoria is a DSM-5 diagnosis. DSM-5 includes like all of the mental and behavioral health diagnoses that that we follow in medicine. And then gender incongruence is an ICD-11 diagnosis. This is a newer one, but these are the two that we most often use. And really what it involves is a persistent difference in gender identity over time. And with gender dysphoria, it's accompanied by significant distress and the desire to be rid of certain body parts, have other body parts, be recognized as the other gender, etc. Gender incongruence is quite similar, other than it doesn't necessarily involve that super distress. And the cool thing about this is as communities become more accepting and families are just more aware and young people are just so savvy, right? If young people are affirmed from the beginning, they don't have to experience all the distress. And so gender incongruence can be a diagnosis code that we use in that case to help gain access to care. And when we're talking about, how many youth are, in the US that identify as gender diverse, about 724,000 youth between the ages of 13 and 17, and this is compared to 2.1 million adults. And then in the state of North Carolina, we're talking about 21,000 trans people between the ages of 13 and 17. And again, using expansive language, this may be non-binary youth included, so 3% of the state population here. And this comes from the Movement Advancement Project. They have a lot of really cool maps. And why is gender-affirming care important? The main reason is that young gender-diverse people deserve to thrive, right? We know that young people with gender diversity experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicidal ideation. We've talked about that a lot in medicine and in public health, and the general community is becoming more aware of that. But that's not associated with the condition itself, but the rejection and the stigma and the violence that young people experience. And so we know that when young people have access to affirming healthcare, so puberty-delaying medications, gender-affirming hormone therapy, that can reduce the odds of severe depression by 60% and self-harm and suicidal ideation by 73% within the first year of use. It's like a pretty immediate thing, which is so cool. And one of my colleagues who I had the honor to work with briefly, Dr. David Inwards Freeland, he was an author on this study. He was very instrumental in Seattle's gender-affirming care clinic, then Brady down in San Diego. Then he was with us in Atlanta for a while. Now he's at Lurie Children's. But he's doing really great work. And so it's really exciting to see this. And in other areas of healthcare, if we had a way to reduce suicidal ideation by 73%, don't you think we can all get behind that? That's amazing. And kind of the opposite thing is also true, though, is that delaying access to this care is not benign. Young people that do not have this access to care continue to experience increasingly severe depression, self-harm, and suicidal ideation over time. The Trevor Project has some really cool data out there. This is from the 2024 survey of young LGBTQ people between the ages of 13 and 24. And this just shows you that young gender diverse people, trans women, trans men, non-binary individuals experience suicidal ideation and attempt at roughly twice as much as their cisgender peers. When we look at ethnicity, Native and Indigenous youth are at the highest risk for self-harm and suicidal ideation. And it comes out to roughly 39% of LGBT youth seriously consider suicide, and 46% of trans youth seriously consider suicide. So that is a huge proportion of youth. We know that suicide is preventable, and in this population, that includes access to gender-affirming care. And this second little slide just kind of shows that when young people are accepted, they experience suicidal ideation attempt at less than half the rate of those that live in unaccepting communities. And that is not really rocket science, right? We all feel safer, more happy and fulfilled, and ready to kind of take on the world when we feel safe, accepted, and loved. So gender-affirming care for youth, what is it actually? Again, it's life-saving and essential evidence-based healthcare that's supported by guidelines. We have the WPATH standards of care. WPATH is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. The latest guidelines were published in 2022 in Montreal. That was a really fun conference to go to. It's beautiful up there. And then the Endocrine Society Clinical Practice Guidelines, very similar. They were last published in 2017. They're due to come out again, but it's kind of being delayed by this political environment. So that will will be kind of forthcoming. And when we talk about this care that is life-saving and evidence-based, I think we all know at this point that it's not accessible, right, to a lot of youth. This map is also from the Movement Advancement Project, and you can see in the South, it is not good. All of the triangle, the red triangle, really bad. In orange states, there is a ban on some or all components of gender-affirming care for youth. When there's like the little red triangle with the exclamation point, that means it's a felony to provide this care in that state. And you can see that things are looking not great for all youth in the American South. Amazingly, the majority of youth actually do live in states with access to care, I think because of the populations in California and New York and whatnot, but our youth here are really struggling. And things are getting worse, right? All these care bans have passed over the last few years, but now we have this federal administration that is really just going after gender diverse youth for no good reason. And on January 28th, there was an executive order that was published that aims to ban care for all youth up until the age of 19, so including legal adults. And this would ban all gender-affirming care, and it would prohibit funding of any care. It would prosecute healthcare providers, healthcare systems, under really absurd things like under female genital mutilation and whatnot. And just the fear that has been stoked from this executive order has already led to the closure of a number of clinics across the country. And so even youth in states that should have access to care, that have shield laws, for instance, like some of those West Coast states and Northeast states, even in those states, clinics are closing because they're afraid of what the federal government might do if they continue to provide this care that they believe in. And so since then, it's just been like one thing after another, right? There's federal judges kind of blocking orders, but then the US Supreme Court decision on US and Scrimeti was released, and that was really disheartening because they decided to uphold Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care. Although interestingly, my understanding of that decision is that it really only is specific to the Tennessee ban and didn't really extend beyond that, so that was kind of a win. And then there was the even more kind of devastating Supreme Court decision with the birthright citizenship order, and kind of within that decision, they limited federal judges' ability to block legislation, executive orders, and whatnot on the federal level. So then it just makes it really unclear kind of what is allowed, what's not. An executive order is not law, but some of it can be sort of implemented or people can be held accountable. And so again, it's just created a lot of fear that is really impacting access to care for young people with gender diversity and their families. And in North Carolina, the law here is pretty similar to Georgia, but actually a little bit more restrictive, which is surprising. Yeah, so in 2023, Georgia passed SB 140 that banned gender-affirming hormones and surgery for young people under 18 that weren't already on that care. In the same year, North Carolina passed HB 808, but this actually prohibits puberty suppression as well. And the reason that puberty suppression is not included in all anti-trans youth legislation is because it's like totally reversible. And so theoretically, there shouldn't be a lot of room to gripe about it because of that fact. But under North Carolina's current law, any young people under the age of 18 that were not already on their care before the law went into effect are not able to access puberty suppression, gender-affirming hormone therapy, or gender-affirming surgery. And these are just to kind of highlight the two, the standards of care and the guidelines, and I'll just share a few kind of key points from them as we move forward that I think are just helpful for really understanding what gender-affirming care for youth is all about. The first thing to know is that it's totally not new. It's been around for a long time, and gender-affirming care for youth actually began in the 1980s, and WPATH has included guidance for it in different ways over time. In 1998, it became more accessible, including hormone therapy for young people ages 16 and up. In 2005 and 2012, it kind of organized the way we think about gender-affirming care for youth into 3 stages, from reversible to semi-reversible to permanent. And then in the most recent edition, there are actually separate child and adolescent chapters and a separate non-binary chapter. And I think that's just important for showing how important it is to individualize care for each of these populations. And it took the age markers out of it because, like all medicine, it should be individualized to the patient and the family. And so, gender-affirming care involves like medication, like medical interventions, and also not, right? Just education and support. These are kind of the key components. So when young people come to us, it's support and education. It's helping guide them through names and pronouns and getting into social transition, navigating things at school, in their places of worship, in their communities and whatnot, and kind of connecting them to resources to support them in their journey ahead. Medical affirmation can't begin until a young person starts puberty. And so the first step is typically puberty suppression or hormone blockers for kids that have already been through puberty. And they're step 1 because they are reversible. They don't impact fertility permanently in the long run or anything like that. They're meant to allow people more time to explore their gender identity, decide what their goals are for affirmation, and prevent them from developing secondary sexual characteristics that they may not want later, like facial hair, like breast development, that kind of thing. And then there's gender-affirming hormones. These are semi-reversible. They cause a person to go through a different type of puberty, essentially, and some of those changes are more persistent. So when a young person starts hormones, they absolutely do not have to stay on them forever, but some changes that happen with hormone therapy can be persistent, and it's just important for families and, of course, patients to know about that. And then gender-affirming surgery is the most permanent part of gender-affirming care. It's almost always done in adulthood. It's so interesting to me to hear all the things in the media, people that are saying, you know, tax dollars are paying for gender-affirming surgeries in prisons and stuff, and I'm like, where is that happening? Because it's definitely not here. That seems crazy. But gender-affirming top or chest surgery is supported in the guidelines for youth ages 16 and up in some cases, because chest surgeries are very effective, have very good outcomes, and are really important for reducing severe chest dysphoria for young people that experience it. And so that's the one sort of caveat, but it is banned in a lot of states that ban various components of care for minors. And then moving on, these are just criteria for accessing care. And this is just important to know, by the time young people get to a clinic like the one that I led, they've been on their gender journey for years. They don't just like show up at our doorstep on day 1. And so it's really important to know that these decisions to access gender-affirming care are thoughtful decisions, that parents are looking out for their child's well-being, because of course they're the ones that love them most, that know what their young person needs and are wanting to support them. And so there's a lot of criteria for the young person's safety, for the family's kind of reassurance and support, and for the healthcare community, so that can kind of support us in this important care. The first thing is just determining that the young person meets criteria for gender dysphoria or incongruence, and that it's been a persistent thing and not just a brief thing, that they have emotional and cognitive maturity to kind of understand what it is that they're looking for from gender affirmation and to provide informed consent or assent, that their mental health concerns have been addressed. Although having other mental health concerns it doesn't prohibit a young person from accessing gender-affirming care. That's really important. There is a link a little bit between neurodiversity and gender diversity. There's some increased rates of co-occurrence, but being on the autism spectrum does not prohibit young people from accessing gender-affirming care, so that's important to know. Reproductive and fertility counseling is really important. Everyone has reproductive rights, and we want to make sure that people make informed decisions, and that, of course, medically, that they've started puberty before we can do any medical things. Also important to note, dual parental consent or consent from all legal guardians is the standard of care. So no young people are walking into a gender clinic and getting hormones without their parents knowing, and that's really important because I think that's distorted in the media. And this care is best that's provided by a multidisciplinary team. It's behavioral and mental health specialists, it's endocrinologists, it's adolescent medicine people, it's gynecology, it's ENT, it's speech therapy, it's all kinds of stuff. And so it's a really very cool team to work in, and kids and families are just amazingly thankful to find us once they finally do. This is just to highlight the comprehensive biopsychosocial assessment. Again, this comes from the behavioral mental health specialist, just documenting the young person's gender identity development, their journey, showing that they have appropriate emotional support, reasonable decision-making capacity, and that they're going to be successful with their care. And the reproduction and fertility counseling, very important. Again, we know that some gender-affirming hormones can impact fertility. People tend to be less fertile, possibly infertile, while on hormones. So we always give people the opportunity to preserve fertility in advance. People can always stop it later to conceive or to harvest reproductive tissues and whatnot. But it's just important that people are informed. This is addressed, and that young people are able to make the decisions that are best for them. And detransition and regret, there's a lot about this in the news. Again, it's nuanced and it's rare. When people stop their gender-affirming hormone therapy, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are going back to identifying as a cisgender individual. Sometimes they do. That's a small fraction of young people and adults even that access gender-affirming care. Some people are just like happy with the changes that have happened and they don't feel the need to continue the medication. This happens probably more often with testosterone because it's a very effective hormone. It does what you want it to do. It's great. Once people experience those changes that are more permanent, they may decide they don't want to continue with their injections or their gels or their patches, and that's okay. Otherwise, when a discontinuation of medical care happens, it's more often due to lack of health insurance coverage, right? Like tons of people experience this all across our country, and so of course gender diverse people do. It may be from stigma or rejection from family or friends, or this like really terrifying political environment where in the media, they're reporting on the federal government subpoenaing children's hospitals for patient information and provider information. That kind of stuff can really scare people out of continuing their care. So just because someone stops medication, it doesn't mean that their gender identity wasn't true, right? And so that's very important to know. And then finally, I just wanted to share a few tips for affirmation and some of my favorite resources for you all so that you can continue your learning journey and look into things that might interest you. Staying informed, I think, is so important right now. Again, we're combating a lot of misinformation. There are so many great websites, community organizations, legal groups, and whatnot. I love Fenway Health has like free webinars and stuff. If you just create your username and password, PFLAG, excellent. Lambda Legal, excellent. If you love all of like the cool public healthy, like epidemiology kind of stuff, Trevor Project, Williams Institute, and the Movement Advancement Project, all very good. And then I love this book called Trans Kids and Teens, Pride, Joy, and Families in Transition. It's written by Elijah Neely, who is a trans. He says in this book that I think is so powerful is that it's okay to acknowledge that parents may feel a sense of loss or just sort of transition when they hear that their young person's gender diverse and that's okay, right? Because they knew this child as one person for a long time and then suddenly that child's telling them that that's not who they are, and so that's okay to feel that loss. What Elijah says is he likes to say, "Go you parent, not only did you raise such a wonderful wonderful young person with such a strong sense of self, but also a young person that knew you loved them enough to tell you who they are." And so I just think that's awesome, and I like to tell parents that too when they're really struggling. And he also says never give up on a family, because young people might say, or families might come in and they might have their like arms crossed and they're just kind of sitting back and they're not asking any questions. But then a couple of visits later, like they're really coming around and they're learning who their kid is in a new way, and it's just a really cool, beautiful experience. This is from Trevor Project. Number one thing, call people what they want to be called. Use their name. It doesn't matter what the name is. It doesn't matter if you like the name or what, or if it makes sense to you, right? Especially if it's your kid or your niece or nephew or your neighbor or whoever. Like, parents argue about names all the time, and I think it's because, you know, they chose the name initially and that was something meaningful. But it's okay. Using a name that someone chooses as their firm name is life-saving. It can decrease suicidal ideation by 29% and suicidal behavior, like attempt, by 56%. So just call people what they want to be called and use their pronouns. And it's okay if you make a mistake. I also love the Transparent podcast. It's like a mother-son pair from like New Zealand or something, so they have very cool accents. But the mom says she used to really struggle using her son's pronouns and name, so she would stand in front of the mirror and practice, right? When things are hard, we should practice them, and that's okay. And so, especially with they/them pronouns, that can be like a little hard for people, and so practice it. And then it's just not hard anymore over time. These are some of the other things, you know, acceptance, believing people, standing up for them, having or displaying pride flags, like little signs of support can show people they're safe. Advocating and building safe communities. You guys are pros at this. This is why you're here, right? This is what you do through Indivisible. There's tons of resources out there. Equality in North Carolina, I found, I think they're very similar to our Georgia Equality. They probably put out voter guides, action alerts, all kinds of stuff. So if this is like your niche, follow them. They seem to be doing great work. And then I know you all vote, right? Because you're here. But just vote in all the elections, little ones, big ones. And just think of gender diverse youth when you're voting, because they're counting on you, and so are we in healthcare. And we're just so thankful every time you show up to the ballot box, because I really do believe it matters, even though we're in the predicament we are in now. We got to get out of it. And then, you know, we're working together to prevent crisis and suicide. There's lots of resources out there. The 988 Lifeline is sort of being defunded in part, but, you know, we want you to know it's there. The Trevor Project line in Georgia, we have the Georgia Crisis and Access line. I'm sure you have something like that similar in North Carolina. And then just this article shows that really all you need to do is accept people. It's that simple, and it's life-saving. So just showing some kindness really goes a long way. And then finally, and I'm excited because I think this will kind of transition nicely into our next speaker, is that it's not all doom and gloom, right? We have so much to celebrate. My gender diverse patients are so fun because they love to see me. My kids with diabetes like don't love to see me. They don't come in thinking, let's talk about my blood sugar today. But my gender diverse patients love to come in, and they're so fun because they're creative and vibrant and expressive and really dedicated, smart young people with like very cool, resilient families. And so there's so much to celebrate. And this is just another book that I bought at like a cool bookstore, and it's a collection of short stories about gender euphoria. So people kind of sharing their just moments of inspiration when they started to feel like their most authentic selves, when they really felt like they could live their life joyfully. And so you might check that out too. I think it's a lot of fun. And I know we're going to get to questions at the end, so we can circle back to it. But thank you so much again for being here today. It's just been a pleasure. Wow.